I'm really interested in talking to you all about an empathy machine as sort of an industrial complex. And even if it's not as exciting as cults or schisms, in the next 15 minutes, hopefully, I can make the argument that like understanding what empathy is first and foremost, and then how it works, and then most importantly, how it's commoditized, I think provides actually a really helpful framework for understanding what motivates people to act altruistically, which is a really important thing, since forever, but especially these days. So for the past decade, but especially the past 5 years, people have been pretty obsessed with this whole empathy machine meme surrounding VR. And even though this broader claim has been around for quite some time, it's really peaked, the discourse around this has peaked with this VR documentary filmmaker named Chris Milk and a TED Talk he gave in 2015 where he called VR the ultimate empathy machine. And we'll come back to Chris Milk in a minute, but first we have to ask, what is an empathy machine at all? So most of you probably have an intuition for what it might mean for VR to be an empathy machine. Basically, it's this thing that takes the advantage of immersion, of consumer virtual reality platforms, distill in someone this feeling of empathy towards another reality. But when you actually think about the implications of what empathy machine might mean, it's kind of weird language to describe something that deals with a pretty complex emotion. Like if you were to show up at a therapist for the first time and on their door there was a sign that said childhood trauma machine, like enter, like you'd be pretty weirded out. At least I'd hope you'd be weirded out. So like why have people taken into this concept of empathy machine so much? So to answer that, we first need to ask, what empathy even is in the first place. And to do this, I'm going to take you all on an empathy crash course, which covers a lot of material in a short period of time, but hopefully I'll be able to describe a few essential points about our contemporary kind of understanding of empathy, which are empathy has no universal definition. I'm sure all of you actually have in your minds a pretty concrete definition of what empathy is, but it turns out that the collection of all those definitions leads to this pretty scattered-brained understanding of what empathy even is. Secondly, each definition is psychologically discrete. Like all those definitions occur in different psychological processes, different parts of your brain. And then lastly, each definition leads to different reactionary behavior, both in the short term and long term. And I'll talk about what number 3 especially means more later on. So this is the dictionary definition of empathy. It's the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And right away, I just want to point out that these two internal verbs here, understand and share, they actually have a pretty huge leap in ability between the two of them, and something of a contrast begins to kind of emerge when you actually tear apart what empathy is. And I think this internal conflation, it's captured quite well in the first place that Americans at least learn about what empathy is, which is when they read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in grade school. And empathy is explained to us then as it's quite pithily as walking a mile in someone else's shoes. This is the phrase that enters everyone's head. And it seems like a pretty straightforward way to describe empathy, but when you break it down, it actually kind of only makes sense for its idiomatic meaning. Like walking a mile in someone else's shoes doesn't actually have that much internal, logic attached to it, at least as much as it explains this psychological phenomenon. So in Huck Finn, there's a superficial form of empathy that Huck and Twain show to Jim throughout the book, but if you look at the meta-narratives that surround Huck Finn since its publishing, this relentless questioning of whether or not Twain is able to actually help create empathy for what it meant to be black in the South. I think this serves as an illustration, just for how inadequate it is to evangelize the simple understanding of empathy as walking a mile in someone else's shoes. And it turns out that most psychologists and philosophers that study empathy agree that it's deserving of way more complexity than what might be contained in some kind of pithy idiom. This is Daniel Batson. He's one of the most important social psychologists that studies empathy. And he's talking more about this idea by pointing out just how fragmented our definitions of empathy are, and how in different contexts, empathy not only means different things, but actually takes on completely different discrete psychological states. And I won't read the whole quote. So the field of social psychology at large has taken this idea and broken empathy down into two main categories to describe the two main approaches to empathy. And they're called affective and cognitive empathy. And it's also, affective empathy is also referred to as emotional empathy sometimes. So affective empathy, it's your ability to sense the feelings of another person and how unsettled this act makes you. It's also called emotional empathy because it can be independently produced as a byproduct of an emotional reaction to a stimulus. But it also can be produced as a byproduct of the other main type of empathy, which is cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is your ability to actually understand the emotions of another person, to take their perspective, and both imagine and internalize their suffering or whatever they're feeling. So affective and cognitive empathy relate to one another in what's called this compassion process. So basically, it's the mechanism that leads you to ultimately do something about the feeling of empathy that you observe or feel in yourself. And so normally this works when this original seed of cognitive empathy leads you to develop an effective empathetic emotions, but then after that you actually do something about it. So this is like the normal way the so-called compassion process works. But you also can develop compassion directly from affective empathy. You don't need cognitive empathy necessarily. So instead of taking someone's perspective, you merely sense their suffering, and that suffering is so tremendous that it still leads you to act compassionately. But this style of response, it's much more susceptible to long-term fluctuations and biases, which I'll talk more about later. But to wrap up this empathy crash course, all you really need to know is that cognitive empathy is actually required for the maintenance and maintaining of compassion. Effective empathy might convince you to act compassionately, but this compassion has a much shorter shelf life, and it's correlated with the longevity of the stimulus that caused the emotion in the first place. So when people talk about these big, grandiose visions of empathy saving the world, just know that they're talking about cognitive empathy, not necessarily effective empathy. Okay, so now let's leave the realm of academia and all these kind of like semantic definitions and see how, given these discrete definitions of empathy, it's being discussed in a more popular context. So this is like one of literally dozens of like identical TED Talks that people have evangelizing empathy. This one is by a guy named, he's a writer named Roman Krasnarich. And let me know if you could hear this. The other volume's not working. Yeah.
It's coming out of these speakers?
Is it really?
I can hold it if you want.
Yeah, is that possible?
Our narrow self-interest, to follow our personal desires. And I believe we urgently need an antidote. And that antidote is empathy. But what is empathy? Empathy is the art of stepping into the shoes of another person and looking at the world from their perspective. It's about understanding the thoughts, the feelings, the ideas and experiences that make up their view of the world. It's about understanding where another person is really coming from.
Okay, awesome. So this clip introduces a few key ideas about how the mainstream approaches empathy. So for one, it seems like he's talking about cognitive empathy, right? He's talking about true perspective taking. And then secondly, he's talking on very macro terms, saying we need capital R revolution, an antidote for modern times. When all else fails, when markets pit each other, each other against each other, empathy can save us. Ultimately, it's kind of this like last stand keystone emotion. And actually almost sounds like he's making political speech, which makes sense because Barack Obama has made basically the same exact speech many times throughout his career, especially in his earlier political career. And this quote from him, he's talking at a childhood poverty gala, and he says, there's a lot of talk in this country about a federal deficit. I think we're going to all have to talk about the empathy deficit. And so as naive as these pitches seem, it turns out that psychology researchers actually potentially agree with both of them. And they all point towards how when everything is kind of boiled down, you take this reductive approach, empathy actually is this keystone emotion that leads to generally people to act compassionately. So it is kind of important to understand. And it's not just TED Talkers, pop scientists, politicians that have latched onto empathy. Whether it's human-centered design or even like effective altruism, many other interest groups see it as a solution or this key thing to understand at the very least. So if I had a full hour, I would like to talk about all these things. But for now, all I'm going to do is talk about what's called digital empathy and its relation to virtual reality. So now we can finally return to the original question I asked, which is, why are people obsessed with this idea of an empathy machine? Well, if empathy is a keystone pro-social emotion, as social psychologists would say, if there was a machine that could effortlessly bring it about, that would be a great thing, right? So how does this actually work? Well, one of the originators of the term, that guy I mentioned earlier, Mr. Chris Milk, I'll let him answer this, and let's see if we get the volume to work again.
You feel your way inside of it. It's a machine, but inside of it, it feels like real life. It feels like truth. And when you're sitting there in her room watching her, you're not watching it through a television screen. You're not watching it through a window. You're sitting there with her. When you look down, you're sitting on the same ground that she's sitting on. And because of that, you feel her humanity in a deeper way. You empathize with her in a deeper way. So we took this film to the World Economic Forum in Davos. It's not a video game peripheral. It connects humans to other humans in a profound way that I've never seen before in any other form of media. And it can change people's perception of each other. And that's how I think virtual reality has the potential to actually change the world. Thank you.
Pretty modest guy, right? Okay, so there are a couple big claims being made here. So one, he says that VR allows us to go through the window, through the frame. You can go into the world ultimately that you're viewing, and in doing so, it feels like truth. It's not television or video games or a picture. It's this fundamentally different kind of media experience. And secondly, it causes you to empathize in a deeper way, he says, in a way that actually changes your mind and changes your behavior. And like Krasnarich or Obama, he's talking about cognitive empathy, not affective empathy. So I want to first talk about this first claim that Milk makes, which is that VR represents a fundamentally new type of interactive experience, especially relative to photographs, TVs, or movies. And to that, I think this might be true at the moment, but what Milk doesn't do is properly contextualize the reaction to the rise of VR relative to the rise of all those other media formats. And so, and it turns out whether it's simply the written word or something more recent like television, each time a new style of media has broken into the mainstream, you actually see a very similar reaction to the way that people are reacting to VR right now. And people say it feels like real life. You're actually there. It evokes this degree of empathy. And there are many examples of this, once again, throughout the history of media. But I think one of the most pertinent examples, at least to VR, is the coverage of the Vietnam War in the US in the 1970s. And so, we don't really need volume for this. But basically, during the Vietnam War, at the hands of networks like CBS, the war newsreel was transformed from this buffered morale booster with lots of heroicism into actually this incredibly realistic, near real-time portrayal of life as a soldier. And you can go on YouTube and watch these, although I don't really suggest it. They're really still to this day just kind of sad and morose, and you could tell it's definitely more of a documentary style of war coverage as opposed to any kind of newsreel that you might hear from World War II. And so it was these documentary style clips, though, that ultimately played, I think, the most important part, and historians, I think, agree, in the subsequent war protests and people actually turning against the Vietnam War at home in America. And so while I concede to Chris Milk that at the current point in time, VR feels more expressive and therefore conjures more empathy relative to other media formats, I think whatever effects are native to VR as a medium are very likely overstated compared to those brought about by its novelty. And we could use this graph to understand this relationship. When we first view something, the focus that comes from the result of its novelty, I think, leads to much greater engagement and therefore a greater empathetic response if a person suffering is at least the subject. But as you gain more exposure, this response comes down and it ultimately reaches this certain plateau of engagement. And case in point, war coverage on CBS in 2019 has pretty much no empathetic effect on viewers. And so this broader phenomenon is summed up really nicely by Susan Sontag in her great book on the subject called Regarding the Pain of Others. And she says the image as shock and the image as cliche are two aspects of the same presence. And even though she's talking specifically about photography here, her quote captures the inevitability of this tipping point between shock and cliche well. And so the other thing that Chris Milk said about empathy in his description of VR was that it was the kind of empathy it produces comes from this deeper level of perspective taking. Because the immersion that it creates, you have a greater ability to understand another's perspective, not just sense it aka he's talking about cognitive empathy. You might remember from before that determining whether or not VR experiences produce cognitive empathy or affective empathy is actually a pretty huge deal because each relates to very different psychological pathways and ultimately altruistic pathways in a long-term perspective. And so if VR is just an effective medium, the bold claims that Milk and others make around VR potentially changing the world, they're kind of unsubstantiated. We have to question them. So not only are users in those situations not achieving true perspective taking, but their empathetic reactions and the pro-social behavior that comes as a result of that, they're only as long-lasting and unbiased as the emotions that come from the viewing experience. So basically, in this picture, Ban Ki-moon here, that's watching Chris Milk's documentary, he isn't actually learning about what it means to be a young Syrian refugee. He's just watching a very compelling novel documentary about the life of a young refugee. And his decision to do something as a result of it is only as good as his ability to take advantage of and preserve the feeling he got upon viewing the film, which is naturally not really working in his favor. So thankfully, there are actually quite a lot of social psychologists and neurologists who study empathy, and as of a month ago, they just completed the first literature review on the million-dollar question that surrounds VR, which is like, does it cause affective empathy or does it cause cognitive empathy? And the verdict is that VR increases empathy in viewers, but only affective empathy, which means that the levels of compassion that the viewer is ultimately acting off of don't have the same kind of strong foundation as if they were coming from cognitive empathy. So basically, yeah, we have to take into account the fact that this effective form of empathy is susceptible to what's called empathetic distress, basically you reacting negatively towards seeing some kind of pain if you see too much of it, and also it's susceptible to intergroup bias. So if you are of a certain group, you're more likely to feel empathetic, all things being held equal, to people that are from the same race or socioeconomic group as yourself. And so ultimately, like just wrapping up, should we take the Luddite approach and reject VR for its flaws, reject the pursuit of empathy for its naivety? Should we discount VR for perpetuating the same kind of colonialist narratives that people say have plagued the social sector since its inception? Well, I think that even regardless if any of these things are just pathways, at this point, there's probably no stopping this iteration of the empathy machine. There are only going to be more of these VR experiences and corollary empathy campaigns in the future. With that being said, I think on one hand, we should acknowledge the fact that cognitive empathy is across the board been on a steep decline anyways. People are nationally and transnationally truly more fragmented than ever. They've retreated into their enclaves, and research shows that cognitive empathy has suffered as a result of it. And I think that if something can at least momentarily resist that via effective empathy, even if it's not perfect, it might be better than nothing. But really what I want to offer all of you as a way to make sense of empathy is to understand it not as this monolithic approach or antidote for our modern times. Think of it, or like an aspirational political campaign, as Obama might make it out to be. But yeah, to interpret it simply what its actual terms of engagement suggests it is. And yeah, when push comes to shove, all the effective empathy machine is doing is really providing a slightly more useful pathway towards accepting philanthropic donations, right? Like these experiences all come down to taking revenue and wealth and transferring it from people that live in rich nations in the global north and transferring it to the global south. I think understanding that process and being more realistic about it is probably a really helpful way to approach this empathy machine and all subsequent empathy machines that will be constructed in the future. And if this is a depressing thing to land on, maybe, but I think leading to this version of the empathy machine is way better than letting empathy brokers and empathy, hype men like Chris Milk ultimately convince us of its potential when in reality it's just kind of another new media format. And that is it. Sorry, I went over time. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryan.